Jimmy Pesto, Bob Belcher's longtime business and restaurant rival. What a guy, right? Across the nearly 15 seasons of Bob's Burgers, this rivalry has mostly remained a constant, and it has been consistent. For the most part, Jimmy and Bob share a pretty specific surface-level dynamic. However, thanks to some specific real-world events, Jimmy Pesto temporarily disappeared from Bob's Burgers for a few years. And despite the more surface-level aspects of his personality and rivalry with Bob, if you look a little deeper, he's kind of a sad dude. A man who desperately wants to be something he isn't, whose only recourse is to gloat at a struggling burger restaurant across the street. So today, let's dive deep and look at the downfall of Jimmy Pesto. Hey, this video is brought to you by two things today. One is my official compilation channel, Johnny Too Cozy, where I'm re-editing tons of my old videos into themed compilations, long videos that are great for sleeping or drawing. And second, my wonderful patrons who get tons of extra content exclusive to Patreon. We're currently in the middle of season 2 of our BoJack Horseman audio commentaries. Check those out if they interest you. Thank you so much for your support. I couldn't do it without viewers like you. So obviously the primary way Jimmy Pesto is explored is through his rivalry with Bob, which is a pretty persistent subject, and sort of an extension of Bob's struggles as a floundering business owner, and we will explore that rivalry in depth, but before we get into the nitty-gritty of that dynamic, we should talk about Jimmy Pesto as a person, really explore everything we know about the man. And one thing that I think is kind of vitally important to who Jimmy Pesto is the fact that his name is not Jimmy Pesto at all.
You know, Pesto's not his real name. It's Pavlovich.
Of course it is. Guy's a complete phony.
And Bob is 100% correct here. Jimmy Pesto is a complete phony. That is actually one of the most important things about his whole persona. He is desperate to be perceived as Italian, and he goes to bizarre lengths to keep up this charade as well. In the episode Bye Bye Boo Boo, Bob finds out that an Italian mobster was gunned down in his restaurant in 1931. Because of this distinction, he gets a special plaque to explain the building's history in the Prohibition era, and Jimmy is wildly jealous of this.
I love mob stuff. I mean, the clothes, the dames, the movies. Oh, I love the movies.
So Jimmy's weird obsession with seeming Italian doesn't just stem from his business sense, but from the fact that he loves how Italians are portrayed in media.
Johnny Dangerously, Joe Piscopo in his prime. Now that's the movie that made me want to be Italian.
I think the funniest thing about this is that Jimmy Pesto based his entire Italian personality after a crime comedy film. His idea of a great mob film is literally a parody, which is perfect since Jimmy is not a real Italian. And so, as you might expect, since Bob wasn't gonna hang the plaque, Jimmy steals the idea to further his charade.
Back in 1911, a real-life mobster was gunned down in my restaurant.
And this is just one of the things he's done to seem more Italian.
Notice anything different about me?
No, thank you.
I'm tan!
Jimmy Pesto is basically cosplaying an Italian dude because he grew up obsessed with mobster films, and he's using that persona to sell cheap pizza and fettuccine.
Say hello to my little drink specials.
Maybe the funniest proof of this is in the tux he wore when he was trying to join the yacht club, tinted green with an Italian flag cummerbund. Truly a hysterical thing for anyone to wear, let alone someone who is not actually Italian. And this phony persona also speaks to his business, because while Bob isn't a particularly good businessman, there's substance behind the food he makes. Jimmy is 100% style over substance, down to the corny specials and themed dishes he runs at his restaurant.
Pasta la vista, baby.
Jimmy constantly resorts to gimmicks to attract customers, like the aforementioned fake mob plaque. He even ran a Pastafarian night of specials where he wore dreads. Yikes to that one. When there was a hostage situation at the bank, he jumped at the chance to deliver pizzas to the hostages for the free publicity, though that did backfire.
That was the worst pizza I ever had. Jimmy Pesto's is crap.
A perfect clip to showcase that Jimmy is about the business, not the food. Plus, he basically says as much to Bob.
Bob, I run a business, all right? I don't know what you're doing with your fancy ingredients.
Pesto basically admits that he uses inferior quality food to maximize profit. There were multiple occasions where he couldn't come close to beating Bob at his own burger game.
It's pretty good. Pretty good. It's not good. It's not good.
He also was chastised at the Best Burger competition for his oregano burger, which I expect was bad because he only used oregano, but it also might have been bad because the cheap meat he buys from his supplier turned out to be horse meat, someone he unfortunately recommended to Bob, putting his business in jeopardy. So I think it's pretty firmly established that Jimmy Pesto Pavlovich is the definition of phony. Despite this, his kids, they're genuine, ridiculously genuine even. They're weird, but they are about as genuine of kids as you could possibly have, especially for a phony like Jimmy. Jimmy Jr. is an unabashed dance lover, despite being a teenage boy. Andy and Ollie are pretty special in their own ways, and none of them are ashamed of who they really are, even though Jimmy Sr. is sometimes a little ashamed of them.
You could put on some Boys to Men and I could slow dance.
Hey, Pepper, no! For the 1000th time, no!
Jimmy Sr. definitely has certain hopes and expectations for his kids. He puts Andy and Ollie in a baseball camp in a desperate effort to get them to succeed in something he cares about.
Last chance to earn my love, guys.
I love that joke.
And while Andy and Ollie are a bit oblivious to their father's attitude towards them, Jimmy Jr. is often actively defiant.
No, Dad, I'm gonna dance.
The reality is that Jimmy Pesto is a bully. The way he treats Bob is straight up bullying behavior, despite the fact that it is a two-way rivalry. And the way he treats his kids reflects this as well. And his son, Jimmy Jr., textually cannot stand bullies. When Jimmy Jr. found out that his best friend Zeke used to be a bully, he is genuinely shocked and ashamed. I'm curious if Jimmy Jr.'s distaste for bullying is simply a way he differs from his father, or whether it's actually directly because of his distaste for his father and his actions. Sadly, Jimmy Sr. doesn't show much love or attention to his kids. What we see is him trying to mold them into something that he prefers, despite the fact that they're really great and genuine people. And when he does show love towards them, it's more opportunistic.
Hey, I thought you guys were with your mother.
You came for us.
I'm just here to watch the demolition. Yes, I came for you.
Hey, a mention of Andy, Ollie, and Jimmy Jr.'s mother, that's as good as any time to mention that though it is not explicitly stated, and though their mom has never shown on screen, Jimmy Pesto is super divorced. He personifies the middle-aged divorced dad vibe, and I think you can understand why this super phony-ass bully of a middle-aged man might find himself single. You have to presume that most of Jimmy Jr., Andy, and Ollie's most genuine traits stem from their mother. And on top of being divorced and not having much of a real relationship with his kids, Pesto also only has one real friend, Trev, and he does not treat that friend very well. Trev is basically your classic yes man. He works for Jimmy and hangs on his every word. He high-fives him for every joke he makes at Bob's expense, does everything Jimmy could ask for in a sycophant, really. And yet, Jimmy treats Trev pretty terribly.
So what's that supposed to be? An ugly ghost or something?
It's a mummy.
Looks like an ugly ghost.
I spent all weekend on it.
The reality is, though Trev seeks the approval of Jimmy and therefore goes along with his bullying, at his core, Trev is a sweet guy.
I can't think of any cities right now.
Chicago.
Do not tell him Chicago.
Even when he's supporting Jimmy's insults, Jimmy bites back at him.
That was a funny comment to make.
Trev, I told you, don't say that was a funny comment to make.
And sometimes we see Trev's real feelings about how Jimmy treats him slip out. At the Belcher holiday party, Jimmy immediately tells him not to say stuff, and we can see how this rubs him the wrong way.
I'm not saying nothing.
Come on.
No.
There's an entire episode where Jimmy is out of town and Trev has to hold down the fort at the restaurant. He attempts to keep up Jimmy's persistent insults at Bob's expense, and I think this is the one episode that really gets to the sad reality of Trev's friendship with Jimmy. Without Jimmy's direct influence, he lets his real feelings out.
Guess I wasn't ready to admit the only bond I have with Jimmy is making hilarious fun of Bob.
It's not hilarious.
But I don't want to be a meanie weenie like you said.
Linda even tries to help train Trev not to high-five when Jimmy makes jokes at Bob's expense, though when Jimmy returns it only slightly sticks with him. But the reality is that Jimmy is the closest thing that Trev has to a friendship, even though it is not particularly deep, and Trev craves a deeper bond with Jimmy. After Teddy has to work a job at Jimmy Pesto's, Bob sort of does Teddy a favor. Teddy wants Bob to be upset that he's working with Jimmy because he wants to feel like Bob thinks of him as his best friend, and so Bob sort of gets fake angry at him in front of Jimmy to reaffirm that friendship. But in that fake outburst, he also points out how real their friendship is, which Trev envies.
That friendship in your life, that's you. Zoom!
I want what they have.
What?
This is actually even sadder beneath the surface. It basically reveals that Trev doesn't think he and Jimmy would be friends if he wasn't being paid to be at the restaurant, which is pretty sad. Trev is honestly one of the most tragic characters in the show, and Jimmy is just nonstop so mean to him. Pesto has this sort of overly controlling nature. He doesn't just want his business to succeed, he wants Bob's to fail. He wants his kids to be normal, and he wants them to want to run his restaurant, to be more like him. He wants Trev's support, but only in the specific way that he wants that support, not in a way that's true to Trev. And that is who Jimmy Pesto is. So now that we've really gotten to the core of the man, let's dive into what we see that man do most in the show, which is mess with Bob Belcher. Jimmy Pesto is properly introduced in the 6th episode of Season 1, Sheesh Cab Bob, though, interestingly, based on the episode production order, this is actually supposed to be his second speaking appearance, but thanks to Fox's broadcast shuffling, it appeared before his first written episode, which was Burger Wars, which we will also talk about soon. Burger Wars makes a lot more sense as an introduction to the character, but I think Sheesh Cab Bob is still a solid introduction to the kind of person that Jimmy is and how far he'll take that rivalry. In this episode, Jimmy won't let his son Jimmy Jr. go to Tina's birthday party just because he doesn't like Bob. Bob even sets aside his pride and asks Jimmy politely to let Jimmy Jr. go to the party, but Jimmy will never pass up an opportunity to humiliate Bob, and so he'll let Jimmy Jr. go on one condition.
I want you to shave your mustache and bring it over in a baggie and I'll pin it on the wall.
I think this pretty immediately shows the kind of slimy, self-centered person that Jimmy is. He's basically using his son as nothing more than a bargaining token in his rivalry with another grown man.
I'm not giving you my mustache.
Well, I'm not giving you Jimmy Jr. then.
Though oftentimes, Jimmy does usually get his comeuppance, despite typically having the upper hand on Bob. In this case, Bob's new friends give him the inside track on some of Jimmy's weirder fetishes, and even though he shaves his mustache for Tina, he doesn't have to give it to Jimmy, instead basically threatening to tell his customers about his extracurricular activities, so Bob is at least spared some of his dignity. The episode Burger Wars, which as I mentioned was written as Jimmy Pesto's proper introduction in the series, is clearly the best introduction to not only the character, but that rivalry as well. It showcases how obsessed both Bob and Jimmy are with each other right off the bat.
Ugh, what's he up to now? What? Oh my god!
Now serving burgers. Burgers!
And this is obviously a really clean introduction to Jimmy as a character. He is taking aim directly at Bob's business. Dude owns an Italian restaurant but decides to put burgers on the menu simply because he wants to drive business away from Bob. And on top of that, he's trying to take over Bob's lease in this episode to open up his own gift shop, knowing that Bob is struggling as a business. In a last-ditch effort to get more customers, Bob hands out flyers for half off a meal at the restaurant, and as you might expect, Jimmy shadily undercuts this effort.
Tonight only are competitors' flyers good for half off your meal?
Here's the thing. Jimmy Pesto's restaurant is generally successful. He is often excited to gloat about this. He's got a lot of regular customers, isn't hurting financially at all, so Jimmy's efforts to drive Bob out of business and take over his lease are purely personal. It's just spite-driven behavior stemming from their weird obsessive rivalry. And it's pretty nasty. Bob has a wife and kids to take care of, and Jimmy wants to drive them not only out of business, but from their home.
This is a war now. This is a war.
This gets out of hand immediately, with Bob trying to serve free sliders in Jimmy's restaurant, leads to them wrestling in the street while Bob is wearing an ill-fitting burger costume. The rivalry doesn't make either of them look good, though obviously Bob is in desperate defense of his livelihood. And miraculously, Mr. Fischoeder realizes just how good Bob's food is and feels that it's worth renewing his lease, basically more as an investment in what he refers to as art, more so than a good business decision. And he does some solid dressing down of Jimmy in the process.
Which brings me to your Shut up!
But these first season Jimmy-focused episodes really do a perfect job establishing Jimmy's whole obsession with overshadowing and humiliating Bob. Obviously the rivalry is not one-sided, they equally hate each other, but Jimmy is sort of punching down. Bob's business struggles, and Jimmy still wants to stifle it even further. And I think, based on what we've established about Jimmy Pesto, that this is likely born out of his own insecurities. Pesto is successful, but he's a man who is pretending to be something he's not. He's got nobody close to him in any meaningful way. Bob might struggle with his business, but he is literally everything that Jimmy isn't, even to a fault when it comes to his business, and he's got a loving, supportive family who stand behind him despite their struggles. These first couple Jimmy episodes also pretty firmly set the formula for how the Bob/Jimmy rivalry is handled across the series. At the beginning of season 2, Bob gets a Burger Boss arcade machine for the restaurant. It's his favorite arcade game from when he was a kid, and he fancies himself to be pretty good at it, until Jimmy comes in and then just immediately destroys Bob's high score.
You got over 300,000 points!
Ah!
Dad, what was your score again?
Never mind, Louise.
And in classic Jimmy fashion, he writes his top score name as Bob Sucks, sending Bob absolutely spiraling, obsessing over beating the score and ignoring anything else in his life.
Bobby, is this turning into another one of you peeing races with Jimmy?
It's not called a peeing race, Len. It's called a pissing contest.
And as is often the case, Jimmy gets his comeuppance in this one too. His antagonization of Bob actually leads directly to him losing his opportunity to become a member of the yacht club.
You're just as pathetic as Bob, with your peeing races.
Peeing races? What are peeing races? That's not going to go over well with the membership committee.
Now, putting Bob Sucks on an arcade game is obviously low stakes, and Bob probably shouldn't have spiraled about it. A lot of what Jimmy does to Bob is petty, but not very serious in this way. Like in Glued Where's My Bob when he tells everybody that Bob is glued to his toilet, or in The Bleakening when he goes to the Christmas party just to put a candy bar in Bob's urinal. But like we saw in Burger Wars, sometimes Jimmy tries to prevent Bob from achieving goals that he genuinely needs for his family to get by. In Family Fracas, Bob's car breaks down.
Hey, who am I? I'm Bob's car!
Good, JP!
Miraculously, he and the Belchers get on a game show called Family Fracas, where they have the opportunity to actually win a minivan, and they are shockingly good at the game show. Unfortunately, even after winning the show, a roulette wheel decides if they get the van or not, though they do get to return to the show until they lose. So night after night, they keep winning Family Fracas, only to barely miss out on the prize that would actually change their lives. But despite this, Jimmy just hates watching Bob succeed on TV.
There's Jimmy Pesto. He's so mad.
And so, he and one of the Belchers' other rivals, Chuck the TV host, conspire, putting the Pestos on the show and basically cheating to gift them the win over the Belchers. And of course, they add insult to injury.
The Pestos win a brand new minivan!
I think this episode is actually a really nice showcase of the sort of lost the battle but won the war dynamic Bob has with Jimmy. They lose the minivan to Jimmy, are humiliated on TV, twice if you include the Pam's Court trial episode they're on to try and prove the game show collusion, and yet, in the end, Bob gets the more meaningful win. He doesn't get a new car, and everyone saw him lose on live television, but they pass Jimmy on the way home and he has a flat tire.
You don't know how to change a tire. Ha!
You don't know how to change.
This is just such a basic skill to learn in terms of just caring for your family. And though Jimmy is on the surface much more successful, he doesn't have these basic skills for these kinds of circumstances. And so Bob changes the tire for him, which has to be pretty humiliating. But a lot of these rivalry-based episodes continually show Jimmy being pretty unrelenting in trying to harm Bob's livelihood. An easy commercial, easy go-mercial, Bob brings in former football player Sandy Can Fry for his Super Bowl commercial spot.
Why do you eat at Bob's Burgers, Sandy?
Because your burgers go great with fry.
And in classic Jimmy Pesto fashion, he also hires Sandy Can Fry for his own Super Bowl commercial, which plays right after Bob's.
Because Jimmy Pesto's pizza goes great with fry.
In Paraders of the Lost Float, Teddy and the Belchers decide to enter a float contest in the big parade, knowing that there are only 5 entrants and that 5th place still gets a prize of $500, which the Belchers badly need. And so, as you might expect, Jimmy ends up also entering the contest, making 6 total contestants and putting the Belchers' $500 prize in jeopardy. Just another example of Jimmy only pursuing something to take it away from Bob. He doesn't need $500, but he revels in the idea that Bob will not get that $500. Luckily, despite his best efforts, Jimmy fails in this one. Bob just entirely lets loose and the whole parade joins his broken down float for a dance party, which secures them 5th place, a nice ending. It's interesting that for the most part, you don't see the other Belchers get as worked up about Jimmy as Bob does, even though he's also affecting their livelihoods, though there are a few instances of Linda starting to bite back at him.
You guys having a going out of business prom, or come on?
Oh, go put a cannoli up your holy. Oh, put a fettuccine in your in-betweeny, Jimmy.
In season 10, Jimmy got a big shiny new awning for the front of his restaurant.
It's made from old Ferrari bumpers.
This thing is entirely impractical and, as the end of the episode proves, causes far more problems than it solves.
It's kind of sweltering under it, and echoey. And during that storm yesterday, some people thought it sounded like the end of the world.
The only reason Jimmy kept it was because it was causing Bob problems as well, namely that it was a mirror that reflected the sun directly into Bob's restaurant. Obviously, Bob is guilty of this as well, but Jimmy will go so far in their rivalry just to spite Bob that it will often have equally negative effects on himself. He really feels the need to turn everything into some kind of competition, and I mean everything. In season 11, Bob tries out meditation and just generally becomes a calmer, more relaxed person, which deeply upsets Pesto, so much that he also starts meditating and turns it into a contest to see who is chiller.
Sorry, pal.
Point for Jimmy. Owning mistakes.
Oh, I didn't mind it.
Point for Bob.
This was actually the final appearance of Jimmy Pesto's voice actor, Jay Johnston. And honestly, maybe that guy should have taken the whole meditation thing a little more seriously, cause, well... On January 6th, 2021, Jimmy Pesto stormed the... I cannot believe that this is part of a Bob's Burgers video, but yeah, Jimmy Pesto's voice actor, Jay Johnston, who is honestly a huge part of so many legendary comedic institutions, from Mr. Show to Arrested Development to Anchorman, took part in the Capitol riots. You know the ones. And so, as you might expect, once that happened, they didn't really want to use Jimmy Pesto anymore. In June 2023, Jay turned himself in after a warrant for his arrest was issued. He posted bail and has since pled guilty to felony charges in connection with January 6th. He could face up to 5 years in prison, though I think it's likely he gets something much closer to like a year. His sentencing is actually very close, coming up on October 7th, so comment below with your predictions on how long Jay Johnston will go to jail for. And so, Bob's Burgers lost its primary rival and antagonist to Bob Belcher, a dynamic established since the first season thrown completely out the window. Even though Jimmy Pesto's restaurant is right across the street, we never, ever see him again. Oh yeah, in season 14 in the episode Believe It or Not, Jimmy Pesto made his grand return, complete with new voice actor, the great Eric Bauza. And honestly, he does a great job.
Wait, why are you coming over here?
I'm bored.
The thing I love about Jimmy Pesto's reintroduction is that they kind of slow things down and just have Bob and Jimmy have a conversation for once, almost like they're reintroducing themselves to one another. Almost. It feels like a metatextual acknowledgement that we haven't seen him in a while and we need to catch up.
You know, you get one rat.
Yeah, well, that's part of the business.
One pack of rats covered in roaches, and suddenly people don't want to eat their spaghetti.
But of course, they were never going to change Bob and Jimmy's dynamic permanently, so they just immediately get back to what we were missing for those 2 seasons. Jimmy being petty towards Bob, and it starts with him noticing Bob's burger of the day, the burger ball pit.
It's a bunch of tiny meatballs instead of a patty.
Tiny meatballs?
Yeah, I was just fooling around. Cheese holds them all in place.
What I love about this one is that Jimmy is not even clever about stealing this. In fact, his idea makes way less sense than Bob's.
Jimmy, the pizza ball pit?
Smart, right? I just tore up a pizza, smashed it into balls, and put it on top of another pizza.
Obviously, meatballs are a thing. Pizza balls, those aren't a thing. And of course, Jimmy's significantly less sensical idea is a smash success, attracting tons of new customers and even a publication that wants to do a write-up about Jimmy's new dish. Okay, I know I already said what I love about this one is, but what I do love about this one the most is that the ending is kind of perfect.
But now all I want to do is tell you something.
What's that, Bob?
I'd rather be me than you.
I am sure we're going to see more Jimmy Pesto as the show goes on, but if this was his last appearance, it would honestly be kind of a great ending to the on-screen rivalry, because Bob finally realizes the entire thesis of this video, basically, which is that despite Jimmy's massive successes and popular business, he is a sad, sad man. He might have the surface level success, but Bob has a significantly more fulfilling life. Jimmy, on the other hand, has to resort to stealing Bob's ideas.
I don't need it. All I need is right up here.
Don't You're whoa.
Sorry, I want that kind of confidence.
Honestly, kind of a perfect place to end this Jimmy Pesto video. His most recent on-screen appearance fully encapsulates how sad he is and how much better off Bob is despite those surface-level struggles that he faces. Jimmy might have a thriving business, but his entire success depends on him pretending to be something he's not. He has a strained relationship with his kids, has full-on middle-aged divorced dad energy, and spends most of his time figuring out how to try and torment another grown man. Bob, on the other hand, is just Bob.
I stay mellow watching Johnny Two Cellos. He talks cartoons, he's a really cool fellow. He keeps you posted on adult cartoons. If that's what you're into, then grab a spoon and a very big bowl of your favorite cereal. Feels like Saturday morning cartoon material. Johnny Two Cellos, watch him on YouTube. Now enjoy this groove and bust a move.